Hello everyone, my name is Sergei. I work for Sophos, based in North Sydney, and today I'd like to talk about one interesting sample that our team has come across. And this particular sample it's not about the sample per se, it's about the trend that we see. That trend is the spilling of the purely malicious techniques that evolved over so many years on Windows platform into other platforms, such as macOS in particular. The sample is detected by a product, and it belongs to POOR, so-called POOR. That's a potential unwanted application. And the company behind this software is a legitimate company with lawyers. So I'm not going to name the name of that company, and I'm sorry for this little disclaimer, but the actual techniques that they employ are really, really interesting. Before I get to the technical discussion, it will be a bit technical. You will see static analysis, dynamic analysis, a brief introduction of what we see in field. If you think about macOS platform and the type of threats that are affected, then surprisingly or not surprisingly, but malware is not that much of a problem. Only 6% of all the detection are purely malicious, but the majority of them are actually potential unwanted applications. If you look at the threat exposure rate, what that means is if you consider the entire customer base of Sophos, and our product is installed, and in approximately in 1% it prevents the infection from malware, and in about 16% it blocks the infection or installation of potential unwanted applications. Geographically, we have the telemetry, we know where the detection is triggered, so the bulk of them come from the United States, from Europe, but if you look at the map, a fair volume comes from Asian region and Australia in particular. If you look at the top malware threats, there aren't that many malicious threats been causing the headache. It's mostly vSearch, FK Codex, Spinion. But if you look at the POOR, this field is there's much more competition here. So you have different vendors fighting for those endpoints. And among the most prevalent families are definitely MacKeeper, Genio, Advanced MacCleaner, Install Core, Bundleware, and so on. So here I come to the point when we'll start discussing the actual sample. First, how is it distributed? It comes as a installer. So if you think about it, to understand the mechanics behind how it works, you have imagine a normal developer of legitimate software for macOS. They want to get money. They want to get some reward, some kind of reward. So they approach this company. The company says, "Okay, we'll bundle your software with our own software, and this is what you're going to install. This is what you're going to distribute from your website." So it arrives in all forms of different installations, and if you install some third-party software, perfectly signed, bypassing gatekeeper, all good, there's a high chance that it's bundled with that type of installer. And what that means is once people install it on their system, they get the software they wanted, but at the same time they will have something else installed on their system, which might be unwanted. It could be rogue AV products, there could be some dodgy extensions for the browser that return some awkward results, and people flood the online forums asking for help, how we get rid of it. And it's a mess, and it all comes from the installer. So how do we analyze it? And let's have a look. The DMG file that it comes as is mounted, and once it's mounted, you can find the content of that file. And among that content, you will find the main executable. This is the main executable Mach-O binary that gets executed. How do you know it's a main executable? If you look at the P list, you will see that executable is specified as a CF bundle executable, and you can figure out that particular file is the first one to run. And in this particular case, it comes under different random names. The names are like example, fatherless, senectitude, I can't even pronounce them, but these are combination of some dictionary words, but each time it's a random name, and each time it's signed with a valid certificate with some developer. We can pull a couple of dozens of such different samples a day, and each time it's signed using different entity. First thing we do, we'll look at the executable, look at the entropy of the file. So as you can see here, what's the entropy? It's the distribution of the bytes. If you imagine a normal text, English text, then probably character A, E, space would be met more frequently than X, Y, Z, right? So the same is applicable to the opcode. Some opcodes are more frequent than other opcodes. So if you look at the entropy of the perfectly valid code, the entropy will not be flat. Flat entropy corresponds mostly to packed data, to compressed data, and you can see the relatively flat entropy for the most of the file is a telltale sign that the bulk of the file is actually encrypted. Where it's jumping up and down at the start of the file, that's probably a valid code. At the end, that's probably where it corresponds to the digital signature. You can find the information in clear text. Next thing we do, we need to analyze that file. So we analyze it, we load it into IDA, the IDA Pro, the disassembler, the golden standard of disassemblers. And the first thing you might notice that once you go into the entry point where the execution starts, there is no code. The disassembler doesn't show you any valid code. You can see these bytes 4 for A, 3E. This is not code. So how does it run? How can it run without crashing? There is no code, right? So the answer is in the concept of lazy and non-lazy classes. This is a concept implemented by Apple for Objective-C classes. So a lazy class is the class that realized later during the execution, as soon as it receives the first message. Apple could not find a better term to give the opposite of lazy class as non-lazy. They call it non-lazy class. So non-lazy class is the class that have the plus load method, and that method will be called first thing. So that method is actually called before the entry point gets controlled. If you look, but now how do we find the non-lazy classes in this executable? And it helps to have a look at the actual source code of the Objective-C runtime. By the way, I don't know why, but when I did these slides, it was available online, but now it's pulled offline. I don't know why, but it can still be found in the history. So if you look at this code right here, you can see that there is a class list right here. And the class list is obtained by calling the function called getObj to non-lazy class list. And that function by itself is a macro where it reads the section called __obj NL CLS list. That stands for Objective-C non-lazy class list. So it takes that section, and from that section within the executable file, it obtains the information about the non-lazy classes. Now that we know the name of the function, the name of the section, we can go back to IDA and say, okay, jump to the segment, and it gives you a list of all the segments. And in that list, we choose obj NL CLS list. And down the bottom, you can see that there are two non-lazy classes declared, right? So the first one right here, it's listed you pay 3, but each time it's a random name. So we proceed to that non-lazy class, and what we see is this. You have the assembly code, and let's have a look at this assembly. It's somehow I don't have a pointer, but let me turn it over a bit. So you can see AL gets C character, right? Then C character gets into RBX plus 8. RBX pointing to the buffer, plus 8 bytes forward. So it pushes the C into that location. Following that, it puts the underscore. Following that, it puts the O. So what does it do? It compiles the string from these characters. And let me run it to simulate the debugger. So how would you do it in the debugger? And you can see C character, underscore, O, 0, termination 0, R, M, then T, then V, and so on. So it compiles that name, VM protect. Why? Because it doesn't want us to see that name in clear text. Following that, it calls dlsim method to obtain the pointer into that function within the library that's loaded into the address space of that executable. So it calls it by the pointer. This is the name, the way it's constructed, reminds a ransom node. Now let's have a look at what it does next. How does it call the mprotect function? The function itself is used to assign certain flags to a memory region. So what it does, it needs to take the code section of the main executable and assign it write access. So normally it has read access and execute access, right? Because it needs to be read and executed, but it also needs to give it write access because it wants to decrypt it. So let's have a look at the parameters passed to the VM protect function. It uses the method it uses. It takes the code section, takes the address of the certain area inside that section, which we can call ncore, and subtract the offset of that ncore in the code section, and then take the whole size of the code section. So imagine a street that there are 13 or 15 houses on that street, and imagine it takes the house number 3, subtract 2 houses, and then take 15 houses. That's how it's doing that. I don't know why, but that's the method it's using. And if you look at the encode location in the memory, there are some gibberish bytes like 23, 2B, OE, OE, so there's meaningless bytes. Following that, it decrypts the whole text section by using the 32-byte XOR key. And let's have a look how it happens from the debugging point of view. So right here you can see either a disassembler using debugger in that disassembler to decrypt. So now I'll run the loop, and while the loop is running, let's have a look at the location of that ncore in memory. That's the location. Right now it consists of zeros, and if I start the debugger simulation, you will see that the entire code section gets decrypted with that ncore as well. So once it's fully decrypted, you can see that now it contains some recognizable text. So the text is Maxim Maximovich Isaev. Does anyone know who that is? So Maxim Maximovich Isaev, okay, I'll get to that later, but for now, what happened now? So the code section now is disassembled, and you can see now a valid code in that underscore text code section. The encode itself, this is how it looked like before it was encrypted. This is how it is now fully decrypted. And if you are curious who that person is, that's a real name of STIERLITZ, who is the full name is Max Otto von STIERLITZ. That's the lead character of the popular Russian book and the movie. You can think of STIERLITZ as a Soviet James Bond. So I know that now because I was born and I grew up in the Soviet Union. So immediately it's just wow. Why are they using that hidden marker? I don't know. I won't speculate, but it's there. Now I owe you the explanation what the title of this presentation means. The never before had STIERLITZ been so close to failure. It's a common phrase in Russian language. It's used to describe a situation when someone's cover is about to be blown. Not necessarily spy's cover. Okay, let's continue. So string API obfuscation. All the strings, all the APIs that it's relying on are encrypted. And let's have a look. Right here you can see there's a 16-byte integer declared on top. That's encrypted string. And it takes that, puts that into the buffer, and appends 2 bytes here. And then it calls the decrypt function. The decrypt function itself takes each character from that encrypted string and XORs it with the specified mask, incremented by the specified constant. If you think it's the only decryption function, you're wrong, because there are, as it turns out, there are more than 1,000 unique decryption functions that encrypt 1,228 strings and APIs and that executable. So decrypting them manually, even a single one, it takes time, but imagine decrypting more than 1,000. So you need to build a tool that can do it automatically. Once it's fully decrypted, that string corresponds to NS application main. So that's an example. Starting from around April 2019, from about 5th of April, they have changed, they have added new obfuscation layer. By the way, they have changed it right now again, just a few days ago. But the obfuscation layer that they've added is the number that you saw previously, 13, is now replaced with a whole function that calculates that number. And again, let's have a look at this function, what it's doing. It's an assembly language, but let's follow it. So AL gets 3, right? SHL, AL 2. SHL shift left by 2 bits. Shifting left by 1 bit means multiply by 2. Shifting 2 by 2 bits, multiply by 4. So 3 gets multiplied by 4, it becomes 12. Now AL goes to ECX, so now 12 goes to ECX. Then move EIX 65. XOR EDX will put 0 into EDX. ID VCX means divide 65 in EIX by ECX, which is 12, so the result is 5. Multiply CL, and CL has 5, 12 multiplied 5 becomes 60. 5 becomes 60. Then take 65 into CL, subtract 60 from 65, the result is 5. Increment by 1 gets 6. So the result is 6. You can read it by trying to comprehend what the code is doing, but fortunately there's a hex race decompiler that just simply collapses the whole function into return 6. Now, dynamic module loading, like if you analyzed injection, memory injection on Windows platform, you would be familiar with that. But on macOS, they also implement the same thing. So here is an example of what it's doing. It takes the encrypted stub, encrypted blob stored inside of the executable file, about 300 kilobytes in size, loads it up in memory, decrypts it, and then decompresses it, and it becomes 900 kilobyte. And following that, it loads it as a module inside the address space of the same executable. And right here, the built-in debugger into IDA is not up to the job. So you need a more precise debugger like LLDB that gives you surgical precision and full control of what you're doing. So right now I'm running image list command for LLDB, and it lists 222 different modules loaded into the address space. And right here you can see in the middle there's a call queue R13. This is where the call is made into the NSLink module function. So it relies on 2 APIs. NS create object file image from memory. That's to grab that uncompressed data in memory and load it up. And next one, NSLink module. This will effectively load that chunk of data as a module. Following that call, if you run the same command, image list, you will find out that there are now 265 modules loaded into the same executable image space. And the executable, the module number 223 is now specified right here. And you can see that its address where it's loaded is 101A50, and the name of the module is image. But now if you give command memread, read the memory of where that module was loaded, you can find out that's the content loaded into the address space. So does anyone recognize what this stands for? CFFAEDFE? What's that magic header stand for?
Mach-O binary.
Yeah, it's feed face. So if you read it from the right hand to the left hand, FEEDFACF, it's feed face. Only feed face corresponds to a 32-bit Mach-O binary. Feed face with an extra bit in the end, turning E into F, becomes a 64-bit Mach-O binary. So it's indeed Mach-O binary. So we can now dump it from memory and analyze it. And once we analyze it, here is the big discovery of what that module is. But before we get to that, let's have a look at the entire structure again. So the first thing, as you realize, that it's not the entry point that gets control, it's the non-lazy class. So the first thing what happens is the non-lazy class plus load method is called. What it's doing, it's taking the encrypted code section called the underscore text, takes that section and decrypts it into memory. After that, the entry point inside that section gets control. And what that code is doing, it's taking the compressed blob, about 300 kilobytes, decompresses it, decodes, then decompresses it in memory. And once it's fully in memory, it will have all of its strings and APIs encrypted, which will then be decrypted. And that module represents itself a very powerful engine. The engine itself doesn't do much. It has to be driven. It is driven with the tasks. And the tasks are coming supplemented by SDK written in JavaScript. And on top of that, the tasks are downloaded from the remote server. So it's fetching these little tasks written in JavaScript, and those tasks, they drive the engine. Now the question is, what can this engine do? I'll get to that later. The anti-debug. Let me mention a couple of tricks down the sleeve of this poor. Anti-debugging. It doesn't want us to debug it. So it's using a trick by calling ptrace function with the pt deny attach flag. And once again, it wants to conceal that string called ptrace from us so that we can recognize what that function is. And for that, it's using the encryption. So ptrace gets 4 bytes. Following that, plus 4, another 2 bytes, plus 6, another 1 byte. So it's calling add to the XOR. So it decrypts the first character of that encrypted string and assigns it to the first byte of that variable that keeps the decrypted string. Following that, it starts the loop. And inside that loops, it decodes all the other characters of that string. And right here, it's following that, it's calling dlsim to obtain the pointer into the function ptrace. The pointer is placed into the variable called fn ptrace, and following that, it calls that fn ptrace directly by pointer. And it passes the flag to that function called pt deny attach. What that means, if you are debugging this executable and call that function, the debug executable will exit with the error code 45, which is called, oops. Is it working? No, it stopped working. So it's called E-not sup, which stands for error not supported. So the executable will exit with that error code. However, let's say we want to trick it. Let's say we want to run it, and then we want to attach debugger after that function was called. Thanks. In that case, where's the button? 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Is it working?
Yeah, the bottom, I think you can adjust the volume.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. No. Oops. One, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. 1, 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Hello, can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. So if you try to trick it and run the executable that called that function, ptrace deny attach, and then you try to attach debugger to it, what will happen? It will attempt to debug it will result in a crash, and actually in a segmentation violation exception. This is what will happen. So how do we defeat that trick? During analysis, we can simply step over the call into the function that calls that deny attach ptrace. And here is an example I'm going to use. So sudo LLDB. So we run debugger, LLDB, and we specify the application. I want you to debug that application. Then it tells us target created. What do you want to do with it? Run. We want to run it. Once we run it, it immediately quits. And it says process exited with the status 45. That's error not supported because of that call into deny attach ptrace. So what we can do is we can stop it at the execution at the point, we can put a breakpoint at the point where it calls that function. This is the call into the function that in turn calls the ptrace deny attach. And if you look at the actual call function, it takes 5 bytes because the address is F5 and next one is FA. So A minus 10 minus 5 is 5. So we know that the call itself takes 5 bytes. So what we do, we give it command to the debugger, RE, register, W, write, PC. PC stands for the instruction pointer. What do we want to write into the instruction pointer? PC plus 5, content of PC plus 5. So we want to take the current content of the instruction pointer, add 5, and put it back into instruction pointer. After we've done that, show us the content of PC, and it tells us that now the content of PC is F5, FA. So we simply stepped over the function that called the ptrace, and then we can continue debugging. But this is just one of the tricks. The next one is the VM detection. The developers of this pool, they don't want this application to run under the virtual machines, under the sandboxes. And why is that? Imagine the developer took the executable and submitted it to a bunch of sandboxes around the world, and that would mean that each installation for each installation, the developer would have to be paid by this company behind it. Internally, this company calls this condition fraud, so they call this function check possible fraud, and inside that function, they want to reliably detect the presence of the virtual machine. The first trick they use, they take the MAC address and check if it starts from a given constant. And for example, 001C42, if the MAC address starts from that, it corresponds to parallels virtual machine. And they use a whole list of these constants to define more than 35 different virtual machines. And this is the list, a snapshot of the virtual machines it can define that comes right from the pool. And one of them is KVM, so it can detect the presence of the hypervisor as well. And as you know, different sandboxes around the world, they are using either virtual machines or hypervisors. Now, the next trick it's using is get the MAC address and IP address, which I mentioned, get host UID. Now, give the name of the USB vendor name, because if you run it under VMware or VBox, it will have that string, VMware, VBox, and the hard disk, the USB name, give me the display ratio. So it's basically fingerprinting the virtual machine. Mouse position since the last mouse movement event. If the mouse is the mouse moving, because if on Mac platform you can't imagine running installer and that receives clicks while the mouse is not moving, they consider this a condition. System uptime since the last reboot. And because each sandbox will have to revert back into the clean state by restoring the clean snapshot. By restoring the clean snapshot, the system uptime will also be reset into the same volume. So by checking that delay since the last reboot, they are detecting the presence of the virtual machine. Full path name of the DMG file. Some sandboxes give it a predefined name, like file name or hash of that file. So if it's not what they expect, they're not happy with it. Position and size of the application window. All of this trickery they're basically fingerprinting the sandboxes. They don't want to allow execution under the sandbox. Now the crash logs, right now if you look at this URL that it's using, it compiles the GET request string and sends that as a crash log, which they host on Amazon. But is there anything dodgy in that URL that you think of? PNG. Why would anyone send a crash log to a remote script disguised as a PNG file? Because if you look at the firewall logs and you try to open Cinnamon and Herald and look at the Wireshark, it will be full of PNG GET requests, right? So many of them are pulled. So it's just to conceal that traffic into the normal traffic, to disguise it under legitimate traffic. Why would they do it? I don't know. Now, the configuration files, they have two types of the configuration files. The first one is dynamically extracted from its own body. And again, questionable method. Why they're doing this and how they do it. They take the actual content of the binary file and start parsing its content from the end to the start. And for each 2 bytes that they calculate the difference of the content between those 2 bytes and looking for a specific pattern that consists of 7 predefined integers. And once they found it, they say, okay, this is I found my configuration file, then they decrypt it with AES-128 algorithm, and this is the example of the configuration file. The config itself contains the product title, product description, icon URL, download URL. And this is when the installer fetches the original installer, legitimate one, from the remote site and executes it. And this assembly shows you this method, how they find it. So this is the loop, one big loop, and in that loop, the condition is they continue until they reach the top of the binary, which starts from the head of feed face, as we mentioned, the head of the Mach-O binary. In that loop, they grab the index -2, that's the previous byte, put it in the variable, this variable, then grab the content of index -1, the current one, and then subtract the previous one from the current one, and that becomes the difference between these 2 bytes. Following that, they, if it's negative, they add 256. Then they check that difference to the signature, and that's the signature, which consists of 7 64-bit integers. And if there is a match, they increment the found counter, and if that counter achieves 7, it means that they found all 7 characters on that signature. Go to found injection. Internally, they find this condition injection. And in the injection routine, they will extract and decrypt that configuration file. The second configuration file is supplied as a JavaScript file, and right here you can see the example of that JavaScript file. So report is where they send the reporting. The add URL is the URL of the remote server from where they fetch the tasks and which drive the engine. Requires root or not. Root if installed, skip VM check, false or true. This is driven by configuration. And here is an example of what is it they sent to the report server. So in Wireshark it looks like encrypted, and by decrypting it, by knowing the key and reconstructing through reverse engineering, we can decrypt the configuration file that they submit. And you can see that they say, they report the OS version, name, type of the browser, OS platform, IP address, SSD size, and some other information, and the fact that whether it's running on a virtual machine or not. This is the report that they submit. Now, the remote tasks that they fetch. Here is an example of the encrypted task that comes. It comes as 85 kilobyte binary. Again, it's encrypted. Once it's decrypted, it will have its own JavaScript wrapped into the headers. So header and footer. And the code will extract that task, and that task will be JavaScript driving the engine. And now coming back, so what is the engine? What can engine do? As it turned out, the engine is a full backdoor. So basically, if you look at the browser manager, it can terminate browser process, set new homepage, screenshot controller, it can take full screen snapshot, it can take snapshot of the image where the mouse is clicking, it can download and execute new tasks, create authorization for tasks using given credentials, system control, it collects full system information, the OS version, all cookies from all the browsers. Why would they do it? Collect the list of all installed running applications, check the presence of VM as we mentioned, add, remove applications to from dock. Get info about the connected iOS devices. So if you take an iPhone and plug it into the system, it will collect the serial number, ID, device class of the connected device. It can search for files recursively on a Mac. It can terminate specified applications, read key values. read any text file, delete specified directories, run specified script with bin bash as a root, collect network information, download files, display alerts. It's a fully functional backdoor. So we come into the final part. Is the vendor behind the software claims that they have millions of downloads, millions and millions of downloads of the software bundled with this particular software. Now imagine that this software inside itself is using techniques to deeply conceal the functionality. If I was to speculate, I would have imagined that someone who wrote malware in the past was building this kind of software, because the techniques are just right. Even the injection of the memory injection is taken from the Mac Hacker's Handbook. It's just copy-paste. The other techniques are really like obfuscation, runtime encryption, encrypting all the strings, encrypting all the APIs, anti-debugging, anti-sandboxing. It comes from the world of Windows malware, but now it's on the Mac platform. The tasks themselves are all symmetrically encrypted. So I personally asked the question: what happens if someone intercepts that traffic? What if someone injects fraudulent tasks into that stream? If someone takes control over the remote website and hacks it, or if the developer goes rogue and the former employee goes rogue and inside a job, or whatever, there's a gazillion reasons how things can go wrong, but they can go wrong if someone gets control and injects these malicious tasks. They will suddenly get backdoor access to so many systems. But on a final note, is what I wanted to mention is it's not about this particular threat. It's not about this particular pool. It's about the trend itself. If you think of Windows, Windows existed for so many years, and it's been in a hostile environment. You can think of it's been plagued by malware, but at the same time, Windows evolved with it, right? So there were new techniques, new methods, address randomization. There were techniques against stack corruption developed, and there were so many techniques being developed, and the industry went along with it, developing their own techniques, their own protection mechanisms. So the modern antiviruses, they have such sophisticated mechanisms to detect this kind of things on Windows platform. But for now, imagine that the system that enjoyed impunity for so many years, and with the sense of security that people have behind macOS, and many corporations, many companies, they run 100% of their endpoints run in macOS. And why? Because they don't need AV. That's a common misunderstanding of what's happening in reality. And finally, it's the proof of the disturbing trend that we're witnessing. And that trend is the spilling of all the techniques that evolved for so many years for Windows. They're now spilling. How? Developers that are hired, very smart people, educated, with high education, get very good rewards and very high salaries working for these companies. They are building this software by using all the techniques that were honed over so many years on Windows. And this is what we're dealing with. So this is the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, please go ahead.
How long did it take you to reverse and write that analysis?
It took a while. I'll be honest with you. So for instance, if you look at the whole period of time it takes to find out that it's a dodgy thing to detect it, that's one thing. Going an extra 80%, probably, or remaining 20% takes 80% of time. This is what people say, 20-80 principle. But if you look at the analysis, so first is, as I mentioned, disassembling, to understand that it's doing this dodgy thing. So it immediately draws your attention. So you can't discard it now. Once you see that thing, you can't discard it. So you go on. Then you find out all these encrypted strings, and you realize that you can manually, you can decrypt 1, 2, 3, 5, 10, but then you get tired, right? So you can't do it manually many in one day. So you got to realize that you need to build a tool. And then you start thinking, what kind of tool do I build? Do I build an emulator that just parses that code and figures out the function? And so it takes time to build a tool that takes the assembler code or plugin for IDA to be able to automatically decrypt those strings and those APIs. Once they're decrypted, you need to patch the code back to put them back into the code so you can analyze it again and now comprehend what's actually happening, what it's actually doing. And it's like a nested dough, so you strip it layer after layer after layer after layer. But the more you strip, the more intrigued you become. And after a certain point, it's a no-return point. You can't simply dismiss it. You can't let it go because it becomes personal. You think someone has done it on purpose to hide it from me. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. No, I'll get to the bottom, and that's probably one of the things that keeps driving. But it takes time. Yes, it takes time.
Have you witnessed these types of potential backdoors being used for malicious purposes?
No, I'll be honest with you, no. And the analysis of this particular pour, the tasks were analyzed to understand what they're doing, and what these tasks are. They were not malicious. At least nothing we have witnessed, nothing we have seen, otherwise we would have reported this. But the thing is, it's there, it's sitting there. It's like the idea, you can think of it as a bomb. It's sitting there. With the right conditions, with all the ducks in one line, it may detonate, right? So we are questioning the reasoning. Why would someone need to have that much power? If I was to speculate, I would assume that the company is actually making a lot of money by building the software. And they don't want their software to be abused. They don't want the hackers to crack it and do some kind of dodgy things on the background to reward themselves, to make the money out of that, to milk the company, to understand how the system works, to game it. And therefore, they've built a very powerful engine to investigate what happens. If things go wrong, they want full investigation. And for that investigation, that's my only reasonable explanation. They put a full backdoor because they want to have full control. Right, but I think another thing is, are you aware of what you're running? Are you aware that you want to, I don't know, play chess and you install the whole backdoor with it? Do customers have right to know what kind of capability they're installing on their Macs? And that's the reason why we classify it as poor.
So are you saying this backdoor was created to stop illegal use of the software, or?
It's a speculation. I'm speculating. I personally think so, but I don't know the true answer behind it. But it's there.
Can you share the region and the industry that the software is from?
Region in the industry?
The region, so where the company's located, and the industry that they're in.
No, I can't mention, because you'll figure out it immediately. And we actually were threatened with lawsuits, so I can't name any. I'll give out any clues.
So are you saying Sophos is now flagging this?
Yes.
The key variable is really the intent. When you flag it as poor to users, they don't necessarily understand the difference between maybe it's potentially unwanted, but how powerful it is, and that it has the potential for future malicious use. Is that warning going to change to try and provide a more transparent message to users?
It's a good question. The true intention, we can't truly define what the ultimate intention was. And the thing is that maybe there's a chance that the ultimate intention was good, but we all know what road is paved with good intentions, right? So we look at this capability, we look at the dodgy characteristics, and in the end of the day, if we define or we detect this dodginess in the code, we can't distinguish if it's endogenous coming from a malicious sample or if it's coming from the sample with the good intentions. It's hard to tell. It's hard to draw the line, right? But if we see these techniques and in the code, we immediately flag it as potential unwanted, unless it does anything malicious. So the moment it starts doing anything malicious, like accordance to our internal policy, we immediately flag it. This is malware. This is it. End of game.
Okay, so it's currently flagged as poor for your
Poor.
users, yeah?
Yeah.
But is that clearly articulated as something slightly different to?
Well, it's a question for the product team, how they articulate it. We do threat research, right? So from the threat research perspective, we say that this application is potentially unwanted because some users might complain and say, you know what, I know what I'm doing, I like it, don't flag it, I find it totally good, I know what I'm doing, and there are people that say that. But with this case, it's hard to articulate because what can I articulate, for instance, about this sample? Apart from the fact that it has a potentially unwanted engine inside that can be abused. There's not much to say, unfortunately.
Well, there might be a risk categorization that you could inform users with in terms of this has a high potential to be used or a high impact.
Yes, and that will immediately might backfire. In terms of the company would immediately claim, we're not doing this. Why are you saying? Because the company keeps very close eye. I did mention something, but I did apply for virus bulletin, and on this coming in London next month, and on 3rd of October, the program was published. Never before had STIERLITZ been so close to failure. 2 days later, they have pulled STIERLITZ and replaced the obfuscation layer. I don't know if it's a coincidence or not. It didn't happen for months. They didn't change encryption for months, but they immediately changed it. Maybe I'm paranoid, maybe it's a speculative idea, but I think these people, they actually come for the conferences. They presented the conferences. They approached myself at the former conference in Objective by the Sea. Why are you detecting us? When 3 guys are standing around you, why are you detecting us? Can you tell? Can you explain us? And I have to articulate that because of this, because of this, because of this, because of this. So it is a difficult environment to even to report about this, because the developers are companies with the budgets, and they're after us, after the developers, after the researchers, and they approach and intimidate and ask hard questions and directly why even using stronger language, which I can't repeat now.